Hi, I'm Ken Farber, the president of the Lupus Research Alliance. It's my privilege to be able to welcome you to this webinar featuring some top experts in the field of lupus who will discuss where we've come, what we need to do to facilitate lupus research moving forward, and what projects the Lupus Research Alliance is working on, along with our clinical arm Lupus Therapeutics, and often in partnership with the pharmaceutical industry. But before we look forward, let's take a moment to recognize how far we've come in just the past year or so. 2 new treatments were recently approved by the Food and Drug Administration for lupus nephritis, a serious complication of lupus affecting the kidneys, and for the first time in a decade, a new treatment was approved for SLE. The Lupus Research Alliance has long supported innovative research projects identifying promising pathways that pave the way for the development of new drugs. The question arises, how do we keep the momentum going? What challenges need to be overcome? And most importantly, what's on the horizon? Here to help us answer some of those questions is a distinguished panel of experts. We have Dr. Maria Dall'Era, a professor of medicine in the Division of Rheumatology at the University of California in San Francisco. We also have with us Shalabh Singhal, who is a program lead at Bristol-Myers Squibb, which is a company that currently has an ongoing trial of a new product that our fingers are crossed might prove efficacious for lupus. Also with us is Al Roy, the Executive Director of Lupus Therapeutics. As many of you know, Lupus Therapeutics is the clinical arm of the Lupus Research Alliance. Al, we're thrilled to have you. Also with us is Ebony Scott. We're delighted to introduce Ebony as our brand new Director of Health Equity at Lupus Therapeutics. Ebony, thank you so much for joining us. So with the introductions done, let's get started. We'll jump right into it. And I want to start with you, Dr. Dall'Era. Can you tell everyone what lupus clinical trials are, how they work, what the phases of clinical trials are, and why they're so important?
Yes, thank you so much, Ken. Thanks for inviting me to be here with you today. So clinical trials are the way that we determine whether a new therapy that has been developed is safe and efficacious, which means that it works well in our patients with lupus. And as Ken alluded to, there are several phases from phase 1, phase 2, up to phase 3, and even phase 4. And these are sequential phases in which we first start to study a new therapy in, for instance, healthy volunteers who are willing to come into a clinical trial so we can assess how a drug is metabolized in a person, how safe it is in a person, are we seeing any side effects, how well is the drug working biologically, those types of questions. And then the drug progresses up through a series of phases where we try to figure out what is the best dose of this particular therapy. And then in phase 3, which are the very large clinical trials, the pivotal clinical trials, are essential for determining whether the new drug is truly efficacious compared to a control, which we call a placebo. And there can even be phase 4, which is after a drug is approved, in which we look for further safety and efficacy of medication. So it's a complex process, but it's logical. And it's done in a way that we can bring safe and effective medications to our patients who desperately need these medications. So I think that answers the questions of the phases. Lupus clinical trials are particularly challenging to conduct. As we all know, and I take care of a large number of lupus patients at UCSF, lupus can be very challenging because it is heterogeneous clinically, but also biologically. And so we're trying to enroll patients with all sorts of different manifestations, whether it is arthritis or rash or kidney disease, into clinical trials. Well, how do you design trials effectively so we can really understand if a new therapy is going to be effective in these different types of manifestations? And that's what we've been working on and struggling with over the years. We have had success recently. This has been a banner year for lupus, as Ken alluded to, with 3 new approved therapies. And the challenge for us now is to keep up the momentum, as Ken referred to. And I'm proud of the work that we are doing in the LRA and with Lucin to think about how can we be smarter about the way that we design clinical trials so we can make sure that we have the best opportunity to determine if a new targeted therapy will work in our patients with lupus and is safe in our patients with lupus. And so we are doing a lot of work in that area. I think some of the challenges that we found is traditional trial designs tend to expect enrollment of large numbers of lupus patients in which there is a lot of competition for these trials. And the numbers are unwieldy. It's very hard to be able to fill these trials to completion. And so we're working on thinking about how do we design smaller trials that are effective in determining whether a drug is safe and will work for a given manifestation. Another challenge, which Ebony will be speaking about as well, is how can we make sure that we offer clinical trials and we enroll patients of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. And this is absolutely key in lupus because lupus disproportionately affects people of color, increased incidence, prevalence, as well as disease severity. And this has been a challenge for lupus clinical trials, and we have to do better. And we actually are coming up with solutions to this problem. And Ebony will be talking about that a bit later. And then lastly, I just want to mention that one of the other challenges is how do we determine the outcome measures that we are going to be using in clinical trials so we can assess whether a drug is effective. Because if we don't have a good outcome measure, there is no way we're going to know if our drug is better than the control, which we call placebo. And we are doing a lot of work in that area as well.
So Shalabh, let me follow up on Maria's comments. You're really at ground zero in terms of running a lupus clinical trial. So my question to you as someone who's in the trenches is how do you begin to overcome some of these challenges? How do you overcome the challenges associated with recruiting people to participate? How do you overcome figuring out what assessment measures to use to determine whether or not the product you're exploring works? I mean, how do you actually deal with some of those issues in real time in the real world?
Ken, thank you for this question. Thank you for hosting this session. I think it's very important for people dedicated to lupus and to advance the science in lupus to connect periodically and move the cause forward. At LRA and at Lucin, you've done this consistently. And the reason I bring that up is because it's partnerships like these that companies like mine depend on to move the science forward. Like as you said, we have over 300 trials at BMS going on at any one time. And we have one of the deepest pipelines that I'm aware of in lupus. We've been doing lupus research for 15 plus years, and we've certainly had our fair share of failures as well. Just like every other company who's invested money in lupus, we have learned a lot from our failures. And as you mentioned, we've had some recent glimmers of hope with 2 approvals in lupus nephritis, 1 approval in systemic lupus. And those approvals give us a guiding principles and pathways that it's easier to walk on a path somebody else has walked on ahead of you. And so I commend the industry for sticking with this disease and enabling success for these patients because it's finally yielding results. We have, as an industry, we have, I think, the deepest pipeline in the industry these days in lupus than we've ever had before. As an industry, we've shown dedication to this cause, to the patients who suffer from lupus. And as Dr. Dall'Era very correctly said, this is not a simple disease. It's a disease that impacts women in the prime of their life, impacts women of color disproportionately. It impacts its pain that is invisible, its fatigue that's underappreciated, It is an invisible disease. One day you look amazing and fantastic and you feel great, and the next day it's the worst day of your life. The problem in lupus development is it's been compared to like a snowflake. No two patients look alike. Everybody looks different. So the challenge has been, how do you design a trial in which the biology of the disease between different patients may be different? The inclusion criteria, that's the patients we pick for the trial, are homogeneous enough to measure it adequately or similar enough to measure adequately, but no two patients look the same. So how do you compromise that? And then how do you design an outcome or a definition of success when no two patients entered in the same parameter? The recent approvals we've seen have shown us some pathways to do that with. The endpoints are complex and difficult to execute. So to do that, we have at BMS some of the best researchers in the world working on our drugs. We have a team that's worked on over 15 years in lupus development. And we've learned from those experiences. So we bank on those failures. And we partner very closely. We know we don't have all the answers. We hardly have any of the answers sometimes. We partner with world-leading physicians, world-leading organizations. We talk to regulators. We consistently speak to patients and to experts from around the world. And we mine data from every database we can find to understand any nugget of truth that will enable our success.
So let me turn to you, Ebony. It's been alluded to a couple of times during this discussion that while we want to celebrate our successes, we also want to recognize our failures or areas where we have not been quite as successful as we wish we had been, and we want to do everything we can to improve. Maria alluded to it earlier. I mean, lupus disproportionately affects women. It disproportionately affects women of color. But as I'm sure our two clinical trial experts would admit, recruiting women of color, especially African-American women, to participate in lupus clinical trials has proved challenging. But it's a challenge that I think we all agree we need to overcome. And I think that's the inspiration for the Lupus Research Alliance and Lupus Therapeutics, creating the program that you are involved with. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, and thank you all for having me serve on this panel. And I am really appreciative to be able to share some of the new initiatives that we are doing within Lupus Therapeutics and Lupus Research Alliance. And as my former speakers have already really highlighted, it's important to understand that diversity is one of our unmet obstacles, or I will say for me, the biggest unmet obstacle in lupus clinical trials. As you know, we have shared before, lupus affects women of color, specifically African-American women, at higher rates than any other group. And so when we're looking at clinical trials and we're looking at who are the population who's involved in these clinical trials, unfortunately, we see that these groups are not represented. You know, we are extremely happy that Safanello was recently approved for, lupus, but when we're looking at the clinical trials that were involved in the, really determining the efficacy of this drug, we see that less than 13% of the patients that were involved were African American, less than 7% of the patients involved were Asian American. And these are similar trends we see in clinical trials across many different conditions. I will share that rheumatology, we are a little bit behind the curve in thinking about DEI in clinical trials. And we're really trying to catch up to cancer, diabetes, and hypertension, really understanding the importance of not only looking at diversity in the patient side, but also the practitioner side as well. We see a lot of biases and things that are happening in our clinical sites. And a lot of times our patients are not able to, for a variety of reasons, to be engaged in clinical trials if they want to be. So I think, a lot of these issues really contribute to the disparities and inequities that we see in lupus, specifically clinical trials. And Lupus Therapeutics and Lupus Research Alliance are really centering these inequities and the disparities in the creation of Project Change by LT. And Project Change is really centering our most vulnerable patients, what happens to be the majority of lupus patients in clinical trials, and not just seeing them as a patient in clinical trials, but as a partner. It's important to recognize when we are creating programs, initiatives, and protocols that we want real life people to be involved in these clinical trials. And a lot of times we see protocols where they are not feasible. They are expecting patients to come to clinical sites 5-6 times a week at different times. And we have to recognize that while these patients have conditions, they still have daily lives to live. And so with Project Change by LT, we're seeing the patient as a partner and bringing them to the table in the creation of actions plans that will address the inequities and challenges that African Americans women face in accessing clinical trials. And so we're really hoping to create sustainable partnerships with community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, grassroots organizations that have not traditionally been at the table in creating partnership to really address and create sustainable and efficacious programs that will address the needs of our most vulnerable patients.
So, Ebony, I know that the program is a new one and it's just getting underway, but when do you anticipate that patients will actually be able to get involved directly? And, you know, we want to be able to assess the success of what we're doing. Are there tools that are going to be developed which help us measure whether or not we're getting to where we need to go?
Great question, Ken. I will share that Project Change by LT, we have an estimated timeline of 3 years, but I want to take a step back and share that this project is really grounded on community-based participatory research. And we understand in order for a program to be efficacious, we have to take the time needed to build the relationships with the partners and stakeholders we want to really work with. And so while it is important and we have funders and we have timelines, we really want to be intentional in identifying the partners and creating these partnerships. So let's say if LT or LRA, whatever reason they are out of these neighborhoods, these pipelines are sustainable and they don't need the leadership of us. They're able to continue going forward. I will share that we are hoping to really start to engage with patient participation in the second year of Project Active. But I want to take a step back and share that the overall protocol design, our action plans are all going to be co-created with African-American lupus patients. So in essence, we're starting that collaboration from ground zero, from starting point, and not waiting until these action plans are developed and to see and to hope that they fit into the communities.
So that's very exciting, and we will look forward to monitoring how it goes over the course of the next few years. You know, Al, you are really the founder of Lupus Therapeutics. Number one, when you founded Lupus Therapeutics, what was the motivation? Why did we think that by creating Lupus Therapeutics, we would help people like Shalabh and companies like BMS? Why did we think Lupus Therapeutics would make a difference? And now that it's a few years old, I wonder how you would characterize our success. Are you pleased with where we've come? And finally, can you just give us a quick reminder of how many trials Lupus Therapeutics has been involved with over the last few years?
So, you know, I will say it's great to see my good friends Maria and Shalabh, and obviously it's always nice to see and work with, obviously, Ebony, my colleague, who we're so happy to have join the LT team. And I will say, Ken, you asked 3 questions of me all at once, and the others you had singular questions. So this is going to be hard. So I'll try to remember.
You can do it, Al.
I'll try to remember them all. So Lupus Therapeutics, as many of you know on the call, was established in 2018. It was really born out of the vision of the Lupus Research Alliance to be far more pragmatic in an approach that really addressed advancing clinical trials in the lupus space. You know, as you know, Ken, the LRA is the world's largest private funder of basic research in lupus for the last, since it was incepted back in the 90s. And so there's been a lot of work and investment in basic and translational science, but not a lot of investment in conducting clinical trials. So the charge from the LRA at the time was, how can we coordinate our activities, leverage our relationships with academia and our investigators to facilitate and accelerate the conduct of clinical research? And we looked around other disease settings and other landscapes and said, are there best practices from pediatric cancer, from cystic fibrosis, from multiple myeloma, that we could translate an infrastructure into lupus and partner very closely with industry, our patients, and our academic rheumatologists to facilitate research. And that's exactly what LT's charge was. And that's what we did. So as you know, as you alluded to earlier, we worked very closely with physician scientists that we know, the institutions that we know. We developed a clinical trial infrastructure, and we hope it's becoming a turnkey infrastructure where we could work with industry to partner with us across plethora of opportunities. One is thinking through their drug development pipelines in lupus. What drugs are they developing? How are they thinking about them? How can we position them? And sort of advising them in that, helping them think about their designs of trials, what makes sense and what patient population, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are, what the endpoints that are used, et cetera. And then how can we facilitate and break down the barriers in doing clinical trials with respect to study conduct? It takes a long time and it's a lot of money to do clinical trials in lupus. And clinical trials in lupus are done all over the world. And I think we had a very unique niche within the LRA and Lupus Therapeutics to create an academic cohort of sites in North America that see different populations of patients, but very important populations of patients, and have access to world-renowned rheumatologists like Maria, and obviously a very unique and well-annotated phenotype of lupus patients seen at those centers. And so we've created this. We are working with more than 20. We're currently partnering with pharmaceutical companies on more than 20 trials in just 4 years of being in existence. We have partnerships with more than 15 pharmaceutical companies, and I'm proud to say that we've worked very closely with BMS on 2 programs, deucravacitinib, and then obviously iberdomide with Celgene, which was acquired by BMS. And we look forward to the day that we can hopefully move forward in a phase 3 program or one or both of those assets. And so that's sort of where we are and what we do. And it's been a wonderful journey. And I think our metric for success is, how do we de-risk trials in a way that allows us to answer questions about whether or not a drug works? And frankly, we want to take informed decisions on informed shots on goal with respect to what we're doing. And, validating a line of research is important, but also invalidating a line of research as quickly as possible is important. And that's exactly what we're doing, and we'll continue to do.
You mean if something doesn't pan out, the faster we know, the better, so we can devote our resources elsewhere. Al, your
right.
comment really brought something to mind, and that is these large pharmaceutical companies are all competing with each other. But what amazes me is how they're all rooting for each other. When one company comes up with something that works, all their competitors in the industry, rather than bemoaning it and feeling bad about it, are actually celebrating it. And to me, that is absolutely remarkable. It's not Coke and Pepsi, fighting for market share. It's when one company succeeds, the world gets better. And, I am not sure that there's a real understanding of that, but there should be. I mean, is that your experience, Shalabh?
Yeah, Ken, I want to echo your words a bit, right? In the heart of it all, I am a physician. I went to medical school. I treated patients. I was in academic medicine in private practice for 7 years before I came to the industry. At heart, I came to drug development to do better for patients. I do this because it is the right thing to do. I found the treatment options we had in practice limiting. We need to use the best of our minds to move the needle forward. At heart of it all, people who work at industry want what's right for patients. On a purely pragmatic perspective, when one company succeeds, it creates a path for the next set of molecules to be developed. It makes it easier for others. Patients benefit, we as drug developers benefit, science moves forward. The whole system works more effectively with more successes we have. So when AstraZeneca has a win with Safnello, I'm the first one with the flag up saying, great job, well done. What can I do to make your case stronger? Because the more you succeed, the more my underlying mission to be in drug development is served.
You know, and I really think that's not only an amazing thing, but it's actually something to celebrate. You know, it can sound like a cliche, but in many ways, this is really a team effort. It's a team effort between academic institutions where there's tremendous lupus expertise. You know, Maria, you represent that. There's tremendous expertise in industry and obviously in patient organizations like ours. So, you know, I think it's pretty fair to say that working in partnership, we will accomplish a lot more than working separately. And the fact that these partnerships have developed and the fact that LRA and Lupus Therapeutics are promoting these partnerships is something that I think is a really good thing for patients. I want to conclude by thinking about the future a little bit. And Maria, I wanted to turn to you and kind of ask you what your ambitions are for both clinical care and research moving forward. And I want to ask you what you think is realistic. Now, maybe we can be a little bit more excited than we were now that we have these 3 approvals in 2021, but we want to be optimistic but realistic. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I'm very excited about what the future brings. I think for the reasons that we stated, we've learned a lot about how to better design clinical trials over the past 2 decades. We now have these 3 new approved agents. When I go to clinic, as I did yesterday, I have a lot more options to be able to offer my patients. And that is a wonderful feeling to have as a physician after waiting for so many years to have that opportunity. And I'm grateful for all of the collaborations with industry and with LRA and Lucent to make that happen. I think what's exciting to me is we are learning significant amounts about the biology of lupus and how the biology of lupus is different in each single patient. But we now have very new technologies in which we can look at the blood, we can look at the tissue, kidney, skin in new ways to try to understand the pathology in those organs, in the blood. Because where the future is going to be is that I, as a physician, can say to my patient in front of me, I know what kind of lupus you have, and this is the medication that I need to give you. I am going to practice what we call precision medicine, patient-centered care. I'm not going to guess anymore. I'm going to understand which targeted therapy is right for which patient. And that's what I am most excited about. And I'm optimistic about it.
So let me ask you a similar question, Ebony. You know, how optimistic are you that within a reasonable frame of time, you know, there are no miracles, we know that, but within a reasonable frame of time, we will be able to redress some of the disparities that we see in lupus clinical trials?
I definitely think we're making strides. You know, the fact that I'm at this table as the Director of Health Equity, the fact that we have Project Change by ALTI, we have other programs and patient-centered or patient engagement initiatives within Lupus Therapeutics really speaks that we are turning the tide and really trying to address these inequities head on. But I do think it would take more people coming to the table to really have an impactful change. We need to look to pharmaceutical companies. We need to look to our patients. We need to look at the practitioners, not just academic medical practitioners, but community practitioners. We know that a lot of our lupus patients are not being seen in academic medical centers, that they are going to their community rheumatologists. So I think, you know, really expanding the partnership is when we really can predict impactful change. But until that happens, I think we're still going to take small strides.
So Al, you know, you mentioned 20 trials with many different companies. Are we going to be hearing results from any of those trials anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think for a handful of trials, you know, we hope, I mean, it's fortuitous that Shalabh's representing BMS. We hope that the phase 2 deucravacitinib SLE program reads out sometime in the first quarter of this year, at least the top line results. And then, you know, we're hopeful that Takeda's anti-CD38 program in SLE will also read out at some point in the second quarter. again, taking a drug that's been used or a target that's been used in cancer and sort of translating it in a different way from the immune system is obviously interesting. But, I think there's a long lag, as you know, Ken, between when the last patient is randomized to the point of actually being able to report out. Sometimes, anywhere between 6 to 12 months, 9 to 12 months. And so we'll have to contend with that delay. But certainly there'll be some exciting news, we hope, in the first quarter of this year.
Al alluded to it earlier. The Lupus Research Alliance is the largest nonprofit funder of lupus research in the world. We've spent tens of millions of dollars over the last several years. And one of the things we're working diligently to do is to identify those biomarkers or biologic factors unique to lupus that can tell us something about why the disease develops, how the disease progresses, and ultimately be used by companies like yours, Shalabh, to determine whether those biological factors can serve as markers of success of the drugs that you're developing. So I think we're going to leave it there. I wanted to thank all of you. Thank Al and Ebony for your tremendous work on behalf of lupus patients. But I also wanted to thank Maria and Shalabh in particular. We hope that maybe we can invite you all back and we can continue this discussion sometime in the future.
Sounds great.
Great. Thank you for joining us, and to all of our viewers, thank you. We hope you found this useful.